I found out my roommate of 5 years has been recording every conversation we've had and selling them as a podcast. I was sitting in a coffee shop on Spring Street when my phone buzzed with a text from my sister. "Why didn't you tell me you had a podcast?" Attached was a link to Spotify. The show was called The Unfiltered Roommate Chronicles. The host's name was listed as Anonymous Observer. The description read, "Raw, unscripted conversations between two millennials navigating life, love, and career struggles. Completely authentic because they don't know they're being recorded." My coffee went cold in my hand. The thumbnail was a blurred photo of our living room. I recognized the blue couch I'd bought from IKEA 3 years ago. My couch, my living room, my life, apparently, monetized for strangers. I'd lived with Derek Paulson for 5 years. We met through a Craigslist ad when I moved to Seattle for my job at a software consulting firm. He was a freelance graphic designer, easygoing, always cracking jokes about his failed Tinder dates. We watched football together, argued about whether Die Hard was a Christmas movie, split groceries down the middle. He was at my dad's funeral. I helped him through his breakup with his girlfriend of 3 years. When people asked if we were brothers, we'd laugh it off, but honestly, it felt close to that. I trusted him with my spare key, my Netflix password, my worst fears at 2 a.m. when the anxiety got bad. I trusted him with everything. That trust, I was about to learn, was worth approximately $600 per episode. I clicked the link. There were 83 episodes. 83. The most recent one had been uploaded 4 days ago. Each episode was between 45 minutes and an hour long. That meant somewhere between 60 and 70 hours of my private conversations were out there, available to anyone with a Spotify account. I put in my earbuds, my hands already shaking, and pressed play on episode 1. It opened with ambient sound, the hum of our refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic from our street. Then I heard my own voice, tinny but unmistakable, saying something I'd said probably 2 years ago, maybe longer. I was talking about my ex-girlfriend, about how she'd cheated on me with her coworker, about how I'd found the texts on her phone. I remembered that conversation. It was a bad night. I'd had too much whiskey. Derek had stayed up with me listening, being a good friend. Or so I thought. Now that conversation had 34,000 downloads. I scrolled through the episode list. The titles were designed to hook listeners. When I found out she was cheating, my father's last words, the promotion I didn't deserve, why I can't go home for the holidays. Each title was a piece of my life, repackaged as content. Episode 9 was titled The Night I Almost Didn't Wake Up, and I didn't even need to click it to know what it was about. 2 years ago, I'd had a severe reaction to a new medication, ended up in the ER at 3 a.m. I'd told Derek about the fear I felt when my heart rate spiked, when the room started spinning, when I genuinely thought I might be dying. That episode had 41,000 downloads. My near-death experience was more popular than my breakup. The algorithm had spoken. People preferred my medical trauma to my romantic trauma. The editing was minimal, but strategic. Derek had cut out his own responses, or most of them, leaving just enough of his voice to sound like empathetic murmurs. It made me sound like I was confessing to a therapist or performing a monologue. He'd added subtle background music during the emotional parts, swelling piano chords when I talked about my dad's cancer diagnosis, upbeat guitar when I joked about my dating disasters. There were listener comments, people talking about me like I was a character in a TV show. I love how vulnerable he is. This guy needs therapy, LOL. Episode 23 made me cry. One comment read, "Do you think he knows he's being recorded? This feels unethical, but I can't stop listening." The commenter's username was EthicsTeacher2019. Even a supposed ethics teacher couldn't look away. I started taking screenshots of everything. The episode descriptions, the comment sections, the sponsor logos at the bottom of each episode page. I documented the listener statistics, the download numbers, the ratings. 5 stars across the board, 4.8 average, 2,367 ratings. I screenshotted the About section, where Derek described the show as a raw, authentic look at modern masculinity and vulnerability. Modern masculinity. He'd turned my therapy sessions, because that's what they were, essentially into some kind of masculinity study. I found the Patreon page. 73 people were paying monthly subscriptions ranging from $5 to $50 for bonus content. Bonus content. What the hell did that mean? I clicked through. Patron-only episodes, extended cuts, behind-the-scenes commentary where Derek explained his creative process. I felt my chest tighten. I couldn't breathe right. The coffee shop suddenly felt too small, too crowded, like everyone was looking at me, like they all knew. I sat in that coffee shop for 3 hours, listening to my own life played back to me. Episode 12 was about my promotion at work, and my fear that I wasn't qualified, that they'd realize I was faking competence. Episode 19 was about my mom's drinking problem and how I'd started avoiding family dinners. Episode 27 was me describing a panic attack I'd had at a client presentation, how I'd locked myself in a bathroom stall and counted ceiling tiles until I could breathe again. Things I'd never told anyone except Derek. Things I would never, ever want on the internet. But there they were, packaged with ad reads for meal kit services and mattress companies. My panic attack, brought to you by HelloFresh. My family trauma, sponsored by Casper. I wanted to vomit. Then I found episode 56. I almost didn't click it because the title made my stomach drop. The call I never wanted to make. I knew immediately what it was. 6 months ago, I'd called Derek from the hospital after my mom had been in a car accident. She'd been drinking, crashed into a telephone pole, and I was the emergency contact. I was terrified she'd killed someone. I'd called Derek from the waiting room, voice shaking, asking him to come to the hospital because I couldn't handle it alone. He'd come. He'd sat with me for 4 hours, and he'd recorded the call, the entire call. My terror, my anger at my mom, my guilt for being angry, my breakdown when the doctor said she'd be okay but needed rehab, all of it. The episode had 62,000 downloads. In the comments, someone wrote, "This is the realest thing I've ever heard. You can hear his soul breaking." Another. I cried during my commute. My coworkers thought someone died, LOL. Someone had taken my soul breaking and laughed about crying during their commute. I closed my laptop. My hands were shaking so badly, I knocked over my cold coffee. The barista looked at me with concern, asked if I was okay. I wasn't okay. I didn't know if I'd ever be okay again. When I finally got home, Derek was in the kitchen making a protein shake. He looked up and smiled, completely normal, like he hadn't spent 5 years secretly building a media empire on my private confessions. He was wearing his usual outfit, gray joggers and a faded band t-shirt, looking exactly like the friend I thought I knew. I stood in the doorway, my backpack still on, and asked him if we could talk. He said sure, turned off the blender, and sat down at our small dining table like we were about to discuss whose turn it was to buy toilet paper. I pulled up the podcast on my phone and set it on the table between us. I didn't say anything. I just let it play. My voice filled the kitchen, talking about my dad's funeral, about how I'd given the eulogy and forgot half of it because I was too numb to remember the words I'd written. Derek's face didn't change for a long time. Then, slowly, he smiled. Not sheepish, not apologetic, just smiled. Like I'd discovered his surprise party early. I paused the audio. My hand was shaking so badly, I almost dropped the phone. I asked him how long he'd been doing this. He leaned back in his chair, casual, like we were discussing a weekend hobby. He said 2 years, maybe a little more. He said it so easily, like the timeline didn't matter. I asked him why. Why would he do this? Why would he violate my privacy, my trust, everything we'd built together? He shrugged. Actually shrugged. He said I should understand, that I worked in tech, that I knew how content creation worked. He said authenticity was currency now, that scripted content was dead, that audiences craved real emotion. Real emotion. My grief was real emotion. My panic attacks were real emotion. My fears about my mother's alcoholism were real emotion. And he'd packaged it all, slapped ads on it, and sold it to strangers. I asked him if he felt anything. Guilt. Shame. Anything. He said he felt proud. He said the show was good. He said I should listen to it objectively, that the editing was professional, that he'd spent hours making me sound articulate and sympathetic. He told me he'd started the podcast 2 years ago as an experiment. He was broke, he said, freelance work was drying up, and he'd read an article about how authentic content was the future of monetization. He'd bought a small voice-activated recorder from Amazon for $60 and hidden it in the living room bookshelf, tucked behind my collection of old Stephen King novels I'd never gotten around to reading. The device picked up everything within 15 feet. Our conversations, my phone calls, even the times I talked to myself while cooking. He said he spent weeks editing each episode, removing his voice, cleaning up the audio, adding music. He said it was art. He said I should be flattered. He used the word collaboration, like I'd somehow agreed to this, like I'd signed a contract I didn't remember signing. I asked him how much money he'd made. He hesitated, then told me the podcast had sponsors. 3 of them. A meal kit company, a mattress brand, and a mental health app, which felt like a particularly cruel irony. He was making around $600 per episode, sometimes more when the downloads spiked. 83 episodes. I did the math in my head. Nearly $50,000. $50,000 from my pain, my secrets, my private moments. I asked him if he understood what he'd done. He said he did, but he also said I was overreacting. He said nothing. I'd said was that bad. He said people loved the show, loved me, and wasn't that worth something? He said I could even join him now, do it officially, split the money. He pitched it like a business opportunity, like I should thank him for the exposure. I told him to delete every episode. He laughed and said he couldn't do that. The show had a following now. People were waiting for new content. He said he'd cut me in 50-50 going forward if I agreed to keep recording. He said we could even start doing it openly, make it a real collaboration. I stared at him and realized I didn't know this person. 5 years of living together, and I'd been living with a stranger who saw me as content, as a revenue stream. I told him I was calling a lawyer. He rolled his eyes and said I was being dramatic. He said everyone records conversations now, that I didn't have a legal leg to stand on. He said podcasts were protected under free speech. He said a lot of things that sounded confident, but I suspected were bullshit. I left the apartment and drove to my sister's house. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay on her couch and listened to more episodes, trying to figure out how many pieces of myself were out there, how many strangers knew my worst moments. My sister, Caroline, found me at 3 a.m. still scrolling through episodes. She took the phone from my hand and asked what was going on. I told her everything. She listened, her expression shifting from confusion to horror to rage. Then she told me something that made everything worse. She'd listened to the podcast 3 months ago. She'd found it through a recommendation algorithm, thought the voice sounded familiar, and realized it was me. She'd confronted Derek about it at a family barbecue. He'd sworn her to secrecy, told her I knew about it, that I was shy about the project and didn't want family listening yet. He'd lied to her face. She'd kept the secret because she thought she was respecting my privacy. The betrayal multiplied. Derek hadn't just violated me. He'd manipulated my family, used their trust against me. Caroline started crying, apologizing over and over. I told her it wasn't her fault. But part of me wondered, if she'd told me 3 months ago, how much pain could I have avoided? How many episodes would never have been recorded? The next morning, I contacted Jennifer Brandt, an entertainment and privacy lawyer I found through a Google search for Illegal Recording Lawyer Seattle. Her office was in a high-rise downtown, all glass walls and abstract art. She had a framed law degree from Georgetown and a bookshelf full of media law textbooks. I showed her the podcast. She listened to 3 episodes while making notes on a yellow legal pad. When she finished, she looked up and told me Washington State was a 2-party consent state, which meant Derek had broken the law every single time he recorded me without permission. She said this wasn't just a civil matter. It was potentially criminal. Wire fraud, illegal wiretapping, violation of privacy statutes. She said the fact that he'd monetized the recordings made it worse. She said we could go after him criminally and civilly, and that the podcast platform could be liable too if they didn't remove the content immediately. Jennifer asked me to compile everything. Every episode, every comment, every piece of merchandise, every sponsor. She said we needed a complete picture of the scope and the profit. I spent 3 days doing nothing but documentation. I created a spreadsheet with episode numbers, titles, upload dates, download counts, and content summaries. I downloaded every episode before they could be deleted. I took screenshots of the Patreon page, the sponsor logos, the merchandise store. I found Derek's LinkedIn where he'd listed podcast producer and creator as his primary occupation since 18 months ago. He'd even put the podcast's listener statistics in his profile summary. Creator of top-rated authentic conversation podcast with 2M plus total downloads. 2 million downloads. 2 million times strangers had listened to my private pain. Jennifer reviewed everything and told me the case was airtight. She said Derek hadn't just violated my privacy, he'd done it systematically and for profit, which would make any judge furious. We drafted a cease and desist letter that afternoon. Jennifer sent it via email and certified mail to Derek, to the podcast hosting platform, and to all 3 of his sponsors. The letter detailed the violations, demanded immediate removal of all episodes, and threatened legal action if he didn't comply within 48 hours. It also demanded full financial disclosure of all revenue generated from the podcast, including sponsorship deals, listener donations, and merchandise sales. Merchandise sales. I hadn't even thought about that. Jennifer told me to check. I found a Redbubble store linked in the podcast description. There were t-shirts with quotes from the show, my quotes, printed on them. Anxiety is just spicy fear, was one. I'd said that during episode 31 while describing a panic attack. Someone had bought 14 of those shirts. I felt sick. There were mugs, stickers, phone cases, even a tote bag that said unfiltered and authentic with a waveform graphic. The waveform was from episode 47, the one about my dad's death. I knew because I'd stared at that episode long enough to recognize the pattern. People were walking around with my grief literally printed on their bags. The merch store had made over $8,000 in sales. Jennifer added it to the financial disclosure demand. She also found something else. Derek had applied for trademark protection on The Unfiltered Roommate Chronicles and several catchphrases from the show. He was trying to legally protect phrases that came from my mouth. My life, my pain. Jennifer said that was particularly damning, showed premeditation and commercial intent. She filed an opposition to the trademark applications. She said we'd bury him in paperwork if that's what it took. Derek didn't respond to the cease and desist. 48 hours passed, then 72. Jennifer filed an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order and a preliminary injunction. We went to court on a gray morning in early November. Derek showed up without a lawyer, wearing a hoodie and jeans, like this was small claims court over a security deposit. The judge was Evelyn Ortega, 61 years old, 23 years on the bench. She listened to a 5-minute clip from episode 47, the one where I talked about my dad's final days in hospice. Her expression didn't change, but I saw her jaw tighten. Derek tried to argue that the recordings were made in a shared living space, that he had as much right to record as I did. Judge Ortega cut him off. She asked if he'd informed me I was being recorded. He said no. She asked if he'd profited from the recordings. He hesitated, then said yes. She granted the temporary restraining order on the spot. All episodes had to come down within 24 hours. Derek was prohibited from recording me, distributing any existing recordings, or profiting further from the content. He was also ordered to preserve all financial records related to the podcast. But the episodes didn't come down. Not all of them. The hosting platform, a company called Podwave Networks, removed 60 of the 83 episodes, but claimed they couldn't access the other 23 because Derek had uploaded them through a different account. Derek claimed he didn't have access anymore, that he'd forgotten the password. It was bullshit, obvious bullshit, but proving it was another matter. Meanwhile, people had already downloaded the episodes. They were being shared on Reddit, on Discord servers, on file-sharing sites. One thread on a podcast subreddit had 800 comments debating the ethics of the show. Half the commenters thought Derek was a genius, that he'd created something raw and real. The other half thought he was a sociopath. Nobody seemed to care much about what I thought. I was just the content, the product, the voice in their earbuds during their commute. I started getting messages. People had figured out who I was. My social media accounts were public, and apparently I'd mentioned enough identifying details in those conversations that internet detectives pieced it together. My Instagram DMs filled with strangers. Some were sympathetic. "I'm so sorry this happened to you." Others were cruel. "You should have known better than to trust anyone." Some were parasocial and weird. "I feel like I know you so well. Can we talk?" One person sent me a list of timestamps from episodes asking me to clarify what I'd meant by certain statements, like I owed them behind-the-scenes commentary on my own trauma. I made all my accounts private, but screenshots of my posts were already circulating. People were analyzing my photos, my captions, trying to match them to things I'd said on the podcast. Someone created a timeline, a literal timeline of my life based on podcast episodes, cross-referenced with my social media. It was detailed, obsessive, and completely violating. Jennifer said we could potentially go after some of these people for harassment, but it would be like playing whack-a-mole. For every account we got suspended, 3 more would pop up. Jennifer recommended I file a police report. I went to the Seattle Police Department on a cold afternoon in mid-November. The officer who took my statement was Detective Michael Torres, 16 years with the department, specializing in cybercrimes and digital harassment. He was in his mid-40s, graying at the temples, with the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too much internet depravity. I explained the situation. He listened, asked clarifying questions, and then told me this was one of the stranger cases he'd handled but definitely prosecutable. Washington's privacy laws were clear. Illegal recording with intent to distribute was a gross misdemeanor, potentially a felony depending on the scale and profit involved. The fact that Derek had made tens of thousands of dollars elevated the severity. Detective Torres said he'd open an investigation, subpoena financial records from the podcast platform and the sponsors, and interview Derek formally. The investigation took weeks. During that time, I moved out of the apartment. I stayed with my sister, then found a studio in a different neighborhood. I couldn't be in that space anymore, couldn't look at the bookshelf where the recorder had been hidden, couldn't sit on the couch where I'd spilled my guts thinking I was talking to a friend. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Alan Porter, a clinical psychologist who specialized in trauma and betrayal. He had a gentle, steady voice and an office that smelled like lavender. He told me what I was experiencing was a violation of trust on a fundamental level, that my sense of safety in private spaces had been destroyed. He said it would take time to rebuild that. He said I wasn't overreacting. I needed to hear that. I needed someone to tell me I wasn't crazy for feeling like my entire life had been stolen. Dr. Porter explained something called surveillance trauma. He said it wasn't just about the violation itself, but the retrospective realization that every vulnerable moment had been observed, recorded, judged. He said I was experiencing a collapse of the boundary between public and private self, that I'd lost the ability to trust my own perception of reality. He asked me to describe what I was feeling. I told him I felt hollow, like someone had scooped out the parts of me that were mine and left me with a shell. I told him I couldn't talk to anyone anymore without hearing my words as if they were being recorded, edited, uploaded. I told him I'd started having nightmares where I was on a stage and couldn't get off, where thousands of people were watching me and I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't escape. He said those dreams made sense. He said Derek had put me on a stage without my consent and I was still trying to get off it. He said the work we do together was about reclaiming ownership of my narrative, my voice, my privacy. It sounded impossible, but I showed up every week anyway. Detective Torres called me in early December. The investigation had expanded. During the subpoena process, they'd discovered Derek had been running not 1 but 3 podcasts using similar methods. The other 2 featured his ex-girlfriend and his younger brother, neither of whom had consented to being recorded. The ex-girlfriend's podcast was called Post-Breakup Confessions and had 41 episodes. The brother's was called Family Unfiltered and had 27 episodes. Both had sponsors. Both had merchandise. Both had thousands of downloads. Derek had built an entire content empire on secret recordings. The detective said they were now looking at multiple counts of illegal wiretapping, wire fraud, and potentially identity theft, since he'd used recognizable details about people's lives without consent. The case was being referred to the FBI because the wire fraud charges involved interstate commerce. The sponsors were in different states, the podcast platform's servers were in California, and the revenue stream crossed state lines. I asked Detective Torres if he'd contacted Derek's other victims. He said he had, and that both had been as blindsided as I was. Derek's ex-girlfriend, Stephanie, had apparently broken down during the interview. She'd shared things with Derek during their relationship that she'd never told anyone else, a rows about childhood trauma, about a sexual assault in college, about her struggles with an eating disorder. All of it was on the podcast, edited and monetized. His brother, Alex, was 23 and recovering from opioid addiction. Derek had recorded their conversations during Alex's darkest period, when he was actively using, when he'd stolen from their parents to buy drugs, when he'd overdosed and nearly died. Those conversations were now entertainment. Detective Torres said both Stephanie and Alex wanted to press charges. He said the case was getting bigger, that the prosecutor's office was treating it seriously, and that Derek was likely looking at significant prison time if convicted. The three of us met once, me and Stephanie and Alex, in a conference room at the police station. It was Detective Torres's idea, said it might help us to know we weren't alone. Stephanie was 31, worked in marketing, had dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't slept in weeks. Alex was thin, fidgety, kept cracking his knuckles. We sat around a table, and nobody knew what to say at first. Then Stephanie started talking about episode 19 of her podcast, the one about her miscarriage. She said she'd been 12 weeks pregnant when she lost the baby. She'd called Derek that night, hysterical, and he'd comforted her. Or she'd thought he'd comforted her. Really, he'd been recording her grief, her questions about what she'd done wrong, her fear that she'd never be able to have children. She said 38,000 people had downloaded that episode. She said she'd read comments from listeners saying they related so hard to her miscarriage. Alex talked about the episode where he described his overdose, the moment he realized he was dying, and called 911 on himself. He said Derek had visited him in the hospital, had seemed genuinely concerned, had recorded everything Alex said about wanting to get clean, about being ashamed, about disappointing their parents. That episode had merchandise, a t-shirt that said, "One day at a time," with Alex's words underneath, borrowed from episode 32. We sat there, three people who'd trusted the wrong person, and recognized in each other the same hollow look. The FBI agent assigned to the case was Special Agent Rebecca Thorne, 11 years with the Bureau, specializing in cyber crimes and intellectual property theft. She had short dark hair and spoke with the kind of calm precision that made you believe she'd already solved the case before she walked into the room. She interviewed me at a federal building downtown, a windowless room with fluorescent lighting and a recording device on the table, which felt darkly ironic. She asked about every conversation I remembered having with Derek, about the content of specific episodes, about whether he'd ever mentioned the podcast indirectly. I told her about times he'd asked me oddly specific questions, things that seemed like normal curiosity at the time, but now felt like prompts. "Tell me more about that," he'd say. "How did that make you feel?" I'd thought he was being a good listener. He was being a good podcaster. Agent Thorne told me the financial forensics were revealing. Derek had made approximately $93,000 across all three podcasts over 2 years. He'd set up an LLC to funnel the money, filed taxes on it, treated it like legitimate income. He'd even hired an accountant. The level of planning and organization suggested this wasn't an impulsive act or a creative experiment gone wrong. This was calculated. He'd researched two-party consent laws and deliberately chosen recording methods that were hard to detect. The voice-activated recorder he'd used was designed for covert surveillance. He'd purchased it from a website that catered to private investigators and suspicious spouses. He'd known exactly what he was doing. Agent Thorne said they were building a case for felony wiretapping and wire fraud. If convicted, Derek could face up to 5 years in federal prison and substantial fines. She said it would take time, but they had him. The evidence was digital, time-stamped, and undeniable. The forensic analysis went deeper. Agent Thorne's team had executed a search warrant on our apartment and Derek's laptop. They found not just the recorder hidden in the bookshelf, but 2 more. One was in a fake smoke detector in the living room. Another was built into a USB charging station on the kitchen counter. 3 devices, strategically placed to capture every conversation in the shared spaces. They also found Derek's editing files, thousands of hours of raw audio, complete with notes he'd made about which segments were usable and which were too boring. My panic attack rated a note. Good content, false, raw emotion, relatable. My description of my dad's final moments. Heartbreaking use for mid-season climax. He'd been curating my trauma like a producer selecting footage for a documentary. The FBI also found emails between Derek and the sponsors, pitch decks where he described the show's authentic emotional content and unprecedented access to real millennial struggles. He'd sold them on the realness, on the fact that I didn't know I was performing. Agent Thorne showed me Derek's notes during one of our interviews, pages and pages of analysis. He'd categorized conversations by emotional intensity, flagging high-value content for future episodes. He'd written things like, follow up on mom's drinking get more details, and ask about work anxiety when he's stressed. He'd been hunting for content, strategically steering conversations toward pain. There was a spreadsheet tracking which topics got the most downloads. Family trauma outperformed relationship problems. Health scares outperformed workplace stress. My dad's death was in the top 5 episodes by engagement metrics. Derek had literally graphed my suffering. Agent Thorne said this level of planning would work strongly in our favor in court, that it demonstrated clear criminal intent, not just poor judgment. She said juries responded to evidence like this, to seeing the calculation behind the cruelty. I looked at those notes and felt something shift in me. I stopped feeling like a victim and started feeling like evidence. Like my pain had finally become useful, but only because it could put Derek in prison. Meanwhile, the podcast platform finally removed all remaining episodes after Jennifer threatened them with a lawsuit for knowingly hosting illegal content. But the damage was done. My voice was still out there, saved on hard drives and cloud storage, shared in private groups. A YouTuber with 300,000 subscribers made a video about the podcast, calling it the most unethical show he'd ever heard, but also admitting he'd listened to 20 episodes. The video got 500,000 views. Comments ranged from sympathy for me to people saying I should have been more careful about what I said around roommates, victim blaming from strangers who'd never had their privacy violated on this scale. One comment said I should sue for millions. Another said I should just get over it. Another said the whole thing was probably fake, that no one was stupid enough to not notice they were being recorded for 5 years. That one hurt, because I did feel stupid. I felt like I should have known. I felt like I'd been living with a predator and hadn't seen the teeth until they were already around my throat. The media coverage expanded. A journalist from a tech news site reached out, wanting to do a story about privacy in the digital age. I declined. Then a producer from a documentary series contacted me, said they wanted to explore the ethics of content creation. I declined that too. I wasn't interested in becoming a story again, in having my trauma repackaged one more time, even with my consent. But other people were talking. Derek's brother, Alex, did an interview with a podcast about addiction recovery, describing how violated he felt, how his lowest moments were now public record. Stephanie, Derek's ex, wrote an op-ed for a women's magazine about digital consent and emotional exploitation. She wrote about how Derek had used her vulnerability as content, how he'd specifically prompted her to talk about her sexual assault and then monetized that conversation. Her article went viral. Suddenly, Derek wasn't just my problem. He was becoming a symbol of everything wrong with content culture, with the way authenticity had become a commodity, with how people would violate any boundary for engagement metrics. The civil lawsuit moved faster than the criminal case. Jennifer filed a complaint in King County Superior Court in January, seeking damages for invasion of privacy, emotional distress, misappropriation of likeness, and unjust enrichment. We asked for $300,000, representing punitive damages, lost economic opportunities, and compensation for the emotional harm. Derek finally hired a lawyer, a tired-looking guy named Raymond Cooper, who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Cooper tried to argue that Derek's actions were protected under First Amendment rights, that the podcast was transformative commentary, that I didn't have grounds for emotional distress because I hadn't sought medical treatment immediately. Jennifer tore that argument apart in 15 minutes. She presented my therapy records, the prescription for anxiety medication I'd started taking, the emails I'd sent to my boss explaining why I needed time off. She presented expert testimony from Dr. Porter, who explained in clinical terms how this kind of betrayal trauma manifested. The judge in the civil case was Honorable David Brennan, 57, 19 years on the bench, known for no-nonsense rulings. He reviewed the evidence during a summary judgment hearing and didn't even let Cooper finish his closing argument. Judge Brennan said the case was clear-cut, that Derek had violated multiple Washington state privacy statutes, that the profit motive made his actions egregious, and that the only question was how much he owed me, not whether he owed me. The trial for damages was set for March. But before it could happen, Cooper contacted Jennifer with a settlement offer. Derek would pay $225,000, relinquish all rights to any recordings of me, sign a permanent injunction against recording me or speaking about me publicly, and issue a public apology. Jennifer said we could probably get more if we went to trial, but it would take months longer, and there was no guarantee Derek could pay a bigger judgment. He didn't have $225,000 in liquid assets, but he'd have to liquidate the LLC, sell equipment, maybe take loans. It would financially ruin him. That, Jennifer said, was the point. During the settlement negotiations, more details emerged about Derek's financial situation. The LLC he'd created, Authentic Voices Media, had been generating steady income, but he'd been spending it as fast as it came in. New recording equipment, editing software subscriptions, marketing expenses, and apparently a lifestyle upgrade. He'd leased a BMW 3 months earlier. He'd taken a trip to Europe. He'd been living like a successful content creator while secretly funding it all with my pain and the pain of others. The settlement would require him to liquidate everything. The car would go back. The LLC would dissolve. His credit would be destroyed. Jennifer said he'd be paying off the settlement for years, probably the rest of his 30s. She said it was appropriate given what he'd done. I agreed. I wanted him to feel the weight of it every month when the payment was due, to remember what it cost him every time he looked at his bank account. I agreed to the settlement. Not because I forgave Derek, not because I thought $225,000 was enough for what he'd taken from me, but because I wanted it to be over. I wanted him out of my life completely and permanently. The settlement was finalized in April. Derek signed the papers, didn't say a word to me, and left the conference room with his lawyer. I never saw him again. The public apology he posted was brief, vague, and clearly written by Cooper. It said he regretted any harm caused, that he'd made mistakes in judgment, and that he'd removed all content and would not create similar content in the future. It didn't mention my name. It didn't mention the money. It read like a politician's apology after a minor scandal. It satisfied the legal requirement but meant nothing emotionally. I didn't care. I wasn't looking for his remorse. I was looking for him to lose something, and he did. His reputation, his income, and soon, possibly, his freedom. The criminal trial began in June. Derek was charged with 14 counts of felony wiretapping under Washington state law and 3 counts of wire fraud under federal law. The prosecution was led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Lisa Kwan, a sharp woman in her late 30s who'd built her career prosecuting digital crimes. She laid out the case methodically. The timeline of recordings, the financial records showing profit, the testimony from me, from Derek's ex-girlfriend, from his brother, the technical analysis of the recording device, and the methods Derek used to hide it. The jury saw everything. They listened to excerpts from the podcast, heard my voice talking about my dad's death, heard Derek's ex-girlfriend talking about her miscarriage, heard his brother talking about his struggles with addiction. They saw the merchandise, the sponsorship contracts, the LLC filings. They saw a man who turned other people's pain into profit without a shred of consent or remorse. Derek's defense tried to paint him as naive, as someone who didn't fully understand the law, who thought he was creating art. They called an expert witness, a media studies professor who talked about the blurred lines between public and private in the digital age. The prosecution called their own expert, a privacy law professor from the University of Washington, who explained in excruciating detail why nothing about Derek's actions was legally ambiguous. Every recording was illegal. Every upload was a separate crime. Every dollar earned was obtained through fraud. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They came back with guilty verdicts on all counts. Derek showed no emotion. He just stared at the table in front of him like he was reading something only he could see. I felt nothing at first. Then I felt the weight I'd been carrying for months start to lift. Not all the way, not even most of the way, but enough that I could breathe a little easier. The trial lasted 9 days. Lisa Kwan was relentless. She brought in a forensic audio analyst, Dr. Kenneth Huang, who'd worked on federal cases for 15 years. He testified about the recording devices, explaining how they were specifically designed for covert operation, how they had voice activation features to maximize battery life and storage, how they'd been positioned for optimal audio capture. He showed the jury spectrograms of the recordings, visual representations of sound waves, pointing out where Derek had edited and manipulated the audio. He explained that Derek hadn't just recorded conversations, he'd engineered them, sometimes asking leading questions to elicit emotional responses, sometimes bringing up sensitive topics deliberately. The jury watched as Dr. Huang played side-by-side comparisons of raw footage versus edited episodes, showing how Derek had removed context, added dramatic pauses, layered in music to manipulate emotional responses. It wasn't just recording. It was production. It was calculated exploitation. The prosecution also called Dr. Lydia Chen, a psychologist who specialized in parasocial relationships and digital ethics. She had 20 years of research experience and had published extensively on privacy violations in digital spaces. She testified about the psychological impact of non-consensual recording, explaining how it created a form of ongoing surveillance trauma. She described studies showing that people who'd been secretly recorded experienced symptoms similar to stalking victims: hypervigilance, loss of trust, difficulty forming intimate relationships. She talked about how the monetization aspect compounded the trauma, how knowing that strangers had paid to access your private pain created a unique form of violation. The defense attorney tried to challenge her, suggesting that the victims were simply embarrassed, not traumatized. Dr. Chen's response was precise and devastating. She explained that embarrassment was fleeting and social. Trauma was neurological and enduring. She said brain scans of surveillance victims showed patterns consistent with PTSD. The jury took notes. One woman in the front row was crying. When Dr. Chen finished testifying, the courtroom was silent except for the sound of someone shifting in their seat. Even the judge looked affected. Sentencing happened in August. Judge Ortega, the same judge who'd granted the restraining order, presided. She heard victim impact statements from me, from Derek's ex-girlfriend, from his brother. I told her about the nightmares, about how I couldn't have private conversations anymore without wondering who was listening, about how I'd lost friendships because I couldn't trust anyone enough to be vulnerable. Derek's ex-girlfriend talked about how her miscarriage, one of the most painful experiences of her life, had been entertainment for strangers. His brother talked about hearing his own voice on a podcast describing his overdose, a moment he'd never wanted anyone to know about. Judge Ortega listened to all of it. Then she sentenced Derek to 3 years in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised release, and ordered him to pay restitution totaling $140,000 to be split among his victims. It wasn't the maximum sentence, but it was substantial. She told Derek that he'd violated the fundamental human need for privacy and trust, that he'd commodified other people's suffering, and that the sentence reflected the severity and calculated nature of his actions. Judge Ortega's statement was scathing. She said she'd seen many cases in her career, but few that demonstrated such a complete lack of empathy and moral compass. She said Derek had systematically exploited the trust of people who cared about him, who'd opened up to him during their most vulnerable moments. She said the profit motive made his actions particularly reprehensible, that he'd treated human beings like content farms, like resources to be mined for emotional material. She addressed Derek directly, her voice cold and measured. She said he'd had numerous opportunities to stop, to recognize what he was doing was wrong, but instead, he'd expanded his operation, adding more victims, more recording devices, more episodes. She said his only regret seemed to be getting caught, not causing harm. She said the 3-year sentence was meant to be a deterrent, not just to him, but to anyone else who thought other people's privacy was negotiable for profit. She said trust was the foundation of human relationships, and he'd weaponized it. Derek's appeals were denied. He started serving his sentence in October at a minimum security federal facility in Oregon. I don't think about him much anymore. Sometimes I still catch myself being careful about what I say out loud, even when I'm alone in my apartment. Sometimes I hear a phrase I used on the podcast repeated back to me by a stranger, and I freeze, wondering if they know, if they listened. The podcast episodes are mostly gone now, scrubbed from major platforms, but I know they're still out there somewhere in the dark corners of the internet. You can't truly delete anything once it's been uploaded. That's the reality I live with. but I also live with the knowledge that I fought back, that I didn't let Derek get away with it, that the legal system, for once, actually worked the way it was supposed to. The aftermath stretched on longer than the trial itself. I had to deal with the practical fallout, the ways Derek's actions had rippled through my life in ways I hadn't anticipated. My employer found out about the podcast through news coverage of the trial. My boss called me into his office, concerned, asking if there was anything in those episodes that could reflect poorly on the company. I had to explain that yes, I'd talked about work, about client projects, about my stress levels, but nothing confidential, nothing that would constitute a breach. Still, HR got involved. They wanted to review the episodes themselves, make sure there were no liability issues. I had to sit in a conference room while they listened to me describe panic attacks before presentations, my fears of being inadequate, my concerns about office politics. It was humiliating. They ultimately determined I hadn't violated any policies, but the dynamic at work shifted. People knew. They'd heard or read about the case. I became the guy from that podcast thing. Conversations would quiet when I walked into break rooms. I felt like I was being watched, evaluated, like my privacy had been violated so thoroughly that I'd never get it back. Dr. Porter tells me the hypervigilance will fade with time, that I'll learn to trust again, to have conversations without that background hum of suspicion. I'm not there yet, but I'm working on it. I got a new job at a different firm, started over in a place where nobody knows my story. I'm dating someone, carefully, slowly, and I told her everything on our third date because I needed her to understand why I'm weird about phones being left on tables, why I need to see the bookshelf in her apartment before I'll talk about anything personal. She listened. She didn't run. That felt like a small victory. The money from the settlement is sitting in a savings account. I haven't touched it. Part of me wants to donate it, to give it to privacy advocacy groups or something, turn it into something useful instead of just compensation for pain. But another part of me thinks I earned it, that I paid for it with pieces of myself I'll never get back. 5 years of friendship, or what I thought was friendship, monetized and distributed to 80,000 strangers, 83 episodes of my life that I didn't consent to share. That's what trust cost me. But it also taught me something, that privacy isn't just a legal concept, it's a fundamental human need, and when someone violates it this completely, the damage isn't just emotional, it's existential. You start to wonder who you are when you're not being observed, when there's no audience, no recording device. You start to question every memory, every conversation, wondering what was real and what was content. I'm still figuring that out, but at least now I'm figuring it out on my own terms, in spaces I control, with people I choose to trust. Derek took a lot from me, but he didn't take everything, and that, I've learned, is enough to build on. That has to be enough. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.